I guess 3 pretty much on the dot, so. All right, welcome. This is Fingertips, Lessons Learned from Creating a Touch-Based Experience. My name is Mark. I work on the fantasy sports team here at Yahoo. And how many of you are familiar with fantasy sports? Fantasy football, basketball, everybody? All right. So for those of you that aren't, actually for those of you that are, I'm just going to give you a quick history of the product really quickly. And this is a little chapter I call iHacker, which is as cool as it sounds. Basically, in the old days, this is the rosters in fantasy football in the old days. And in order to make changes, you had to go and change your select menus here. It's really easy to make mistakes, and it's really not fun changing a page full of select menus. And they wanted better interaction. This was long before I ever started. So during a hack day, one year, does everybody know what a hack day is? A hack day is it's one of the best things we do at Yahoo. It's a 24-hour just pure coding to get a cool idea up, to get it to at least proof of concept stage. And so during a hack day, they created this, which made the whole interaction into drag and drop using YUI. And so let's see that in action. So here we have the rosters in essentially what the old style was, having to change around these select menus. But if you switch it just to drag and drop, now all of a sudden you want to go and change out Matt Schaub for Eli Manning, even though he earned me a bunch of points last week. You just drag it, and it's doing essentially what you used to have to do by hand, which is to change all those select menus. It's just doing it for you in a very nice, easy way, in a way that prevents you from being able to make mistakes. So that was cool, and for years this has served us really, really well. And then last March, Apple introduced the iPad, and which was a great device, except that what happens is that this is how you had to use it on the iPad, because even though you had drag and drop, we didn't have drag and drop working with touch devices. So what we did this year during our hack day, it was actually a 3-day hack day. The project I worked on was to transform this into a touch experience. So this involved a lot of things. That was making first of all, I had to rewrite all the roster code, the drag and drop code, into YUI 3, because it was in YUI 2. And this was before YUI 3.2 came out with all the touch support. And so I created a little touch library to add touch support to it. And this was just before. It's sort of funny how that worked out. And along the way, I learned some lessons. Now, the first thing you need to know is that what I learned was that, let's say these rosters already were in YUI 3. And let's say that 3.2 is right around the corner. So theoretically, I could have made these entirely touch-enabled and given a great experience to everybody just by waiting and just by doing nothing except upgrading to 3.2, right? Turns out that's not true. As it turns out, there's little things that make a big difference when you're making a touch device. So merely adding touch support is not enough to create a great experience. And we ran into that headlong. Oh, by the way, this was the goal. Recreate the desktop experience for touch devices. And immediately, we started running into problems. And this is a little story I like to call my big, dumb finger. See, okay. So, actually, I need to switch back over here really quick. First, let me give you a quick, let's talk about cursors versus fingers. The cursor here, that's very small. It's very small, it's very precise. Your finger, on the other hand, is big. And it gets worse, because you have to consider the rest of the hand, the arm, and that's even bigger. And this is where you really need to have the actual device and test with the actual device, because these are things that a simulator won't tell you. So you really need to have a device and use it in order to see these things work properly. So let's see the problems that arise here. Okay. So here I've got, this is just a demo version of the roster, or just a very simplified thing. So let's see what happens if I just, use basic drag and drop support. So I'm dragging this guy around, but if you notice, my finger is covering up what I'm dragging. And it's really bad. Like here I have to do it, but the way you hold the iPad normally puts it at an angle that it's really easy for your hand to cover up what you're dragging around. So, and that's the part that shows that my finger is big. The part that shows that my finger is dumb is this. I start to drag, I go, oh, my finger's covering it up. Well, that's not a big deal. My finger's in the way. I'll just move my finger. Oh. And to be honest, that's an honest mistake. Anybody can do that. The dumb part is that I did it more than once. So, what were the solutions? Well, the first solution is that on the desktop, what we do is we don't actually drag from the top left corner. We drag from the left side and down 50%. But that's really basically the same thing. See? Finger's still covering it up here. So I thought, okay, well, maybe that way of dragging is outmoded. Maybe that's the problem. We don't need to be dragging from this little drag icon here. Maybe what we need to do is do some of the other things that YOY lets you do. For instance, YOY has the ability to, when you start dragging, to automatically center the thing you're dragging around. Well, that's pretty good, right? That's not bad. Except that the problem here is that when you start and you click over on the left side, the name here is now off screen, which is just as bad, really, as covering it up while you're dragging. And in fact, worse, because if we were to do this on the desktop, we would be hiding the name for not just users on touch devices, but users on the desktop as well. Well, there's another option, which is to automatically offset what you're dragging. So wherever you touch, that's the part that starts dragging. Wherever you touch, that's the part that starts dragging. So I click over here, drag over here, and it's dragging here. If I click in the middle of it, that's where you go. And that would have worked great, except as you notice, when we start dragging, we have essentially a shortened, a smaller version of it when you're dragging. And that means if you click over here and start to drag, well, this just looks broken. And so what I realized we need to do is to do a bit of a compromise, which is that we would, well, let me show you. Which is that on the desktop, we would continue to be dragging as we were, but on the iPad, iPad, iPhone, other iOS devices, we would be dragging in a slightly different place that you can see just enough of the name to give you confidence that you're that you're dragging who you think you're supposed to be dragging. And so that's a really elegant solution. It works. It seems to work well. I think it gave us the correct solution. But the big problem is, and here you can see, we created a plugin for it, and shows like for the mice, we're giving it one set of, it's basically 5% over, 50% down vertically. And then for touch devices, we're going 35% over and 50% down. That's very elegant. But you notice that the goal of recreating the desktop experience for touch devices, first step, what have I done? I've failed that, because that was the wrong goal. What I learned here was this. The touch experience, if you're recreating a desktop experience, the touch experience is going to be similar but not identical, because it's a different device, it has different capabilities, it has a different way of inputting, and the interactions are just going to be different, and you have to be aware of that. And you can't always cling to what's going on the desktop. Sometimes you have to make little changes. So that was a very important lesson to learn. That's really why it's first. And if there's nothing else you can take from this, take away that the touch experience is similar but not identical to the desktop. But there's other things that you have to consider as well, which is that the iPad, the iPhone, they're fantastically fast, very speedy devices for something that size, for something of that power consumption. But compared to what's sitting on your desk, compared to what's sitting on your lap, they're very slow, especially when it comes to JavaScript execution. So this is where I learned that JavaScript animations are something you really got to be careful about. There's several other performance things, but the JavaScript animations give you a really excellent, are something you have to really pay attention to. So let's take a look at that. Okay, so this is going to be a traditional using YUI Animate. And I'm just going to click it. And it's a little chunky. It kind of looks not bad on here, but on the screen, you can see it's a little bit, it's just a little, a little chunky. So what's the best way to fix this? What's a good way to get faster animation? What? CSS, great. All right, let's see it. And problem solved. Oh, it's actually still a little bit chunky. And it turns out that CSS animations have the same problems JavaScript animations do. The browser has to recalculate the height and width for all the steps along the way, has to change them, has to reflow the document. All those things cost. Repainting the DOM is the most expensive thing the browser is going to do. And CSS animations don't get you around them for the most part. Actually, it turns out that there is a way around that. And that is to be very careful about what CSS properties you're animating. So you can do the traditional ones, which we say are a little chunky. These ones, a little chunky. Or the magic ones, which are very, very smooth. What's going on there is that we're using what are called the CSS accelerated animations. Oh, sorry. So we are changing specifically just well, first of all, I'm using the CSS animations, WebKit's animations, which are a little bit different than transitions, but you can use either one. The properties apply to both. But the main thing is that we are transforming WebKit transform and opacity. And I'll get to what WebKit transform does, but basically you saw it in action. Scale, meaning we're making it bigger. Opacity, you can go from 1 to 0. And that really makes a big difference because these, changing width, height, these cause very slow reflow calculations. But what happens with the transform is that the browser is able to essentially take an image, take a quick little snapshot of the thing you're about to transform and just work straight on that snapshot. And it doesn't have to reflow the document it can, at all. It can be handled as an image. And essentially it sort of cheats, but it cheats in a very fast way. And so this, these things go faster. And it might have looked kind of all right, the animations that we were doing before. You say, oh, I can live with that. Except that it starts to get worse once you start adding other things to it. If you're doing like a drop shadow on it, it's even slower. But this, still fast. If you're doing multiple ones at once. No. But, yeah.
Big dumb finger.
Big dumb finger, absolutely. Here, it's really hard to get the rhythm right, but you can do it. And like I said, you can do actually a whole lot more than just width and height. The WebKit transform CSS property allows you to do things like skewing, do what's called translate, which is basically moving it around, rotate. It has 3D versions of a lot of these things, so scale 3D. The truth is I never got scale 3D to make it look like anything 3D. But translate 3D, which is moving something around in 3D space, rotate 3D, which flip over, and you can even combine them and to do really crazy stuff. By the way, even though background color isn't one of the officially accelerated ones, it seems to not cause, at least in simple cases, that bad of a hit. So you can still have the, so you can sometimes do background color as well. And isn't this crazy? Because this is a device that can't handle a simple JavaScript width and height without choking, but it can do that in just a couple lines of CSS. And by the way, this is part of what makes it such a great time to be a front-end engineer, because now we're getting to play with things like that. If this were 2 years ago, you know what the innovative thing I would be telling you about is this CSS drop shadow, about how cool that was. And that's old news now. We're living in a whole new world. So the lesson here is, these are the properties, again, to go over real quick. There's scaling, rotating, translating, skew. Keynote can't actually animate a skew, which, when I realized that, it made me wonder why I did this presentation in Keynote at all. I should have been doing it in Safari. But the sexy things that you were doing before, the things that add sizzle, they slow you down. But you can get around them sometimes by being even sexier, by having the more cutting edge things, the things like the WebKit transform. Now, that's not always true, but a lot of times these things are going to save you. And they're really going to save you, especially in times where you don't want the animation to impact the interaction at all. And that's really what you don't want. You don't want your animations to run, hopefully fast, nothing worse than these slow animations, but run smoothly and not get in the way of the user. And so if you limit yourself to WebKit transform, opacity, and sometimes background color, at least on the iOS devices, you're going to have a much smoother experience for your audiences. Let's see. But that's not the end of performance issues, because the just straight experience, if we had just taken what was working on the desktop, changed the animations, upgraded 3.2, we still wouldn't have had a good experience because the JavaScript performance is slow in a lot of other ways. And this is where I've learned a valuable lesson. I learned to procrastinate. I didn't finish this slide. Yeah. And specifically, there's a few different ways. And let's take a look at what the problem is here. Now, this is a little demo of an initialization. Now, when you see that square disappear, that's sort of just a symbolic way of saying that the browser is ready to be interacted with, or that things are happening. I threw that in there just so you can easily see when the browser is saying, I'm ready to go. And so let's take a look at that again. Wait, okay, go. And that's the reason that's slowing down is because we're creating a whole bunch of drag objects. And creating those are, unfortunately, very, very expensive. So what can we do to fix this? Well, the first thing we can try is not diving into the DOM until we have to. So in this example, I'm getting all the things I'm going to make draggable, and then I'm going to animate the thing, the animate thing, and then I'm going to make them all draggable. But that's actually kind of bad, and you get a bit of a performance increase by just adding the animate here and doing the doing the CSS query to get the objects to get your object afterwards. And so let's take a look here. It's still waiting, but that starts a little bit sooner. It's hard to see the difference, but that is a little bit faster. And the reason is because when the browser has to do the CSS query, the browser wants to, for performance reasons, batch up all its DOM changes and only apply them when it has to. So with the CSS query, when a CSS query comes along, it'll say, okay, well, I better flush out all my DOM changes so that I give him back the things that, I give the JavaScript back or the program back the elements that it thinks it's requesting. So that helps a little bit, but it's still not very good. So the next technique is because this really isn't procrastinating. This is just doing things in a different order. Real procrastination means doing stuff later, just really doing it later. So here we've got the drag creator, make row draggable. Okay. But that means that it's going to loop over all of these things before it's ever going to before the DOM is ever really going to be ready. It's going to loop through all these things and make them draggable, and that's going to be slow. So what we can do is we can just do these things later. So they've got a 50 millisecond timeout. So it's going to loop over all of these things, give them all a 50 millisecond timeout. And really what that's saying is a bunch of things that when the browser is not busy doing other JavaScript tasks, it's going to execute these things as they come up. It's going to execute the make row draggable when it comes up. Y.later, for those of you who don't know, is basically a wrapper around set timeout or set interval. It's a lot better than that because you can manage scope a lot easier. Anyhow, so let's see what that does. Okay, so let's take a look. This is it. This is going to be it with doing things Y.later. Okay, now we go, and then now the stuff comes in. So that stuff comes in when it has to, but the rest of the browser isn't being held up by the execution. So that means you're giving responsiveness back to the user sooner, and when the browser is not busy being responsive, it's able to do its expensive operations. But really, as good as that is, it's doing stuff later is great, but the better thing is just to not do stuff at all. There is the drag objects are expensive to create. However, they created this delegate option, which basically lets you delegate drag objects so that it doesn't create them. You say, here's the things that are going to be draggable, here's the container, and respond when they start dragging, but you don't have to create the individual objects. For a few reasons, we weren't able to do this in the fantasy rosters because every single drag object has a unique set of groups that it applies to. It's for complicated reasons, but it really can make a huge difference. And in the drag delegation works, I think, for most drag and drop situations. So if you find yourself waiting for drag objects to be created, check this out. Okay, that's even slower than it should be. So this is, and everything still draggable, just as it would be. So there you go. So the lesson here is that when you can't make things faster, make them more responsive. Because really, the user doesn't care how fast you're doing stuff. The user cares how responsive your stuff is. So sometimes what you're trying to do is return control to the user, return control to the browser, let the browser get on with its tasks, and do things when you need to. Because there is only a certain amount of optimization you can do. You can always optimize more, but ultimately, at the end of the day, certain things are expensive, and you don't want to let that get in the way of the user. There's a bonus tip here, which is to read this book, High Performance JavaScript, and everybody, except you, Doug, need to, because you're missing the talk right next door. Thank you, by the way. You're missing the talk next door about High Performance JavaScript from the man who wrote the book. So since you're missing that, you actually do need to read the book. Probably not you either. But that is performance. Basically, you need to be thinking about responsiveness a lot and a lot more deeply and be a lot more clever in the iOS devices. So we got it fast. We've figured out how to make our animations responsive. We've figured out what to do about dragging everything around. What next? That means we're done, right? But as it turns out, again, no. And this is, I can read minds, sort of. Because it turns out sometimes, in certain situations, you might have to read the user's mind. Sort of. Now, let me show you what I mean by that. Okay, so we get towards the end of our 3-day hack day, and I've made it fast. I got everything working. I give it to some people to test. I give it to 3 people to test, and they all come back with the same complaint, which is this: well, I tried to scroll it, but it just kept wanting to drag. And I just want to scroll it. And let's expand this so that it looks, you really can't scroll it here. You're just trying to drag. Well, that's terrible, right? So, and this sort of taught me a very fundamental lesson because all 3 of them said the same thing, and they were very frustrated by it. And this taught me frustration is the gap between what the user expects to happen and what actually happens. That gap gets wider, the users get more frustrated. That gap gets narrower, the users get less frustrated. Get it to 0, the user experiences joy. So, what did we do? Well, I figured, okay, here's the thing. This red area on the desktop, you can drag anywhere along here, and that will initiate a drag. So you can click here, and that will start the drag. You can click even over here on the position. That will start the drag. Okay, but that's sort of the problem that we're running into here. So what if we just decrease the draggable area? So we limit it to a smaller area. That way users can scroll over here, drag over there. And I thought to myself, okay, fantastic. Problem solved, right? So here, drag around, drag around, drag around, fine. Here, scroll. Whoa, not a problem. Okay? And so I said, okay, guys, try this. This is an excellent solution. And they said, it's really not that good, because a lot of times it'll be scrolled in, especially if you're on an iPhone. It's got such a small screen, you really need to scroll in to see what you're doing. And if you're scrolled in more, or if you're zoomed in more, I should say, then, even though this little area was draggable, this is the area that you kind of want to be draggable. And that taught me, again, that I didn't solve the problem, because frustration is what happens, is the gap between what the user expects to happen and what the user wants to happen, or what actually happens. And I was experiencing this myself, because what I expected to happen was that they would tell me I had finished this problem. And what was actually happening was that they told me I needed to be able to read the user's minds, because that's what needs to happen in order to solve this problem. You need to be able to read the user's minds, because the drag gesture, which is put your finger down and drag around, is exactly the same as the scroll gesture. Put your finger down and drag around, right? It's indistinguishable. And I thought, there's nothing we can do about it. And I was ranting and raving about how these unreasonable people don't understand that I don't have ESP. And I thought, well, maybe we actually can read the user's minds a little bit. And here's what I mean by that. And by the way, the reason we can is because we're using Safari. I think Joe Hewitt wrote a WebKit extension, or wrote a Firefox extension, so there you could if you wanted. The issue is this, is that when people are scrolling, or at least when they're flicking, if they're just flicking, their finger is gonna hit without pausing and keep moving up. Hit without pausing and keep moving up. That's basically the flick gesture. Move, move. And so that can be shown as this, that touches down, goes up. And that's different than the dragging gesture, or what I'm going to call the dragging gesture. So basically what I did is, when the touch start happens, we see if there's any movement within 25 milliseconds. It has to be really short, so that you don't get in the user's way. And the scroll gesture, you can figure that most of the time it's basically going to be within the 25 milliseconds. And if they pause for at least 25 milliseconds, that means that they're dragging. So let's see that in action. So, and actually implementing that was really interesting. We used synthetic events for that. We used custom events. There's all sorts of tricks we had to do in order to make that work. But that actually works pretty well, because you can still drag like you wanted. And we still got this okay, I guess I didn't make this area not scrollable. That doesn't matter. But if you want to just flick, there you go. Whee. So now my iPad is reading my mind. I'm saying I'm going to touch and move my finger, and that means I want to scroll. And now I'm going to touch and move my finger, and that means I want to drag. Look how, yeah. But as you're seeing, it's imperfect, and that's why there's the asterisk and the sort of. It's imperfect, and the truth is it's going to be imperfect. The big problem that we're running into here is that we're taking this desktop experience, and this part we didn't want to change the design. So we're recreating that on a touch device without thinking that when you scroll in the desktop, you use a very different action than when you drag. But on the touch device, scrolling and dragging are going to be the same gesture. So the real correct solution that if we could start fresh entirely, that I think we would go with, would be to design our way around it. Either make clear what are draggable handles, like what specifically would trigger a drag and what wouldn't. Limit the dragging to a specific area. So if you just had, like in a lot of the YUI demos, for instance, you don't notice this problem because there's just a little square and a square inside that. And that framing square kind of says, stuff in here is going to be draggable. So you drag around there, you design your way around it. UI is what gets you out of this. So the lesson here is that you can reduce frustration with psychic powers, but to eliminate frustration, you need to have a great UI. That is what really helps to eliminate frustration. Here's the thing is, as much as you reduce frustration, having any frustration hang around is kind of a bad thing, so you really want to ideally eliminate frustration. And sometimes that means going back to the drawing board. So that is basically all the tips I learned. There's a couple things I want to talk about. First, the resources. If you're looking at some of these things, like the CSS transforms, The URLs for these things are absurd, so what I'm just going to do is just do a search on Yahoo for Safari Visual Effects Guide, Safari Web Content Guide, Safari DOM Editions Reference, and the Web Context Guide, the section on handling events, is really good. Although you won't necessarily, in most cases, need to think about that too much as long as you're using YOI 3.2, because YOI 3.2's touch support is really, really excellent. Now, I wanted to close with this thought, going right back to the beginning. The touch support, the touch experience is similar but not identical to the desktop. That's true. If you're recreating a desktop experience, you need to make changes at some point or another. What happens if we just take the desktop entirely out of the equation? What if we just skip the desktop? What if we're not talking about? What if you're building something just for the touch devices and just for the amazing things that they can do? Now, I don't have any examples, but it's just something to think about, which is that right now what's limiting us is, in many ways, the desktop metaphor. The range of interaction that we've got available to us on touch devices is really exciting. And so if you have the opportunity to work on a touch-only interaction, then I'm very jealous of you, because that's the sort of thing where you can create actual, magic. And we're going to throw that word around, because when the iPod was introduced, or when the iPad was introduced, Steve Jobs kept calling it magic, and a lot of people sort of made jokes about that. But I kind of agreed, though that was magical. Then this was what I thought at the time. I thought, wow, the iPad is magical because of what it can do, because it can do all these neat things. But in working on this project and just seeing, it's not what it can do, it's what you can build with it. So really, the iPad, I think, is magical because of what you can do, what you can build for it, all the things that enables you to create. I think seeing the websites that are springing up for it, the apps in the App Store that are so innovative, you can see that. And just so you know that I'm not a complete fanboy, I don't just mean that the iPad. I mean things like YUI, for instance, all the ways that it enables us. Because working on this really gave me a new respect for the architecture of YUI 3. It is a beautiful, beautiful system. And within YUI, I mean even in a larger context, the web right now is fantastic. The things we can do right now are amazing. And so really, right now is magic. And it's magic because of what we can do. So I know this is a very touchy-feely way to end. But I did say this is about touch experiences. All right. And are there any questions?
Is the source code of the examples anywhere?
I'm going to see whether or not YUI is a place to put them. I can put the slides on SlideShip, but they kind of make no sense by themselves. So I made the examples so that I could zip them up, and I'll put them somewhere. Yeah, I'll put them up on GitHub. Is that way you can fork my example? Right. But I think they kind of want to see some of the... Yeah. It's not... The source code of the examples is not beautiful source code, because but it's educational. All right. Any more?
So who made the decision to just say recreate the desktop experience? Because just in terms of data, you cannot display as much on an iPhone that is also a touch device that you could do on a desktop.
That's true. Well, the decision really came down. It was me and my boss's boss. Me because I really wanted to work on this project. My boss's boss because he said he wants the sport sites to be touch enabled, but that was basically the bulk of the direction, touch enabled. And the truth is, I'm kind of cheating. Nobody put this hardcore directive down. It's just going into it. That's what I saw as my goal, is just recreate it. Just add touch. We're done.
Because that was the first thing I loved about the Safari or the Safari definition. So the first sentence is when you start working for iPhone or iPod, even then, it said this is not a mouse device. It's a touch device. Different rules apply.
Yeah.
That was the first sentence of the whole documentation.
Yeah.
And that's something to keep reminding you of.
It is, and it is absolutely true. And like I said, it's the first thing I ran into, which is that you got to handle things a little bit differently. You have to think about things like how big your finger is, how big your hand is. These things, I mean, and this is why, using the simulator of the device won't reveal these issues, because it's a touch device, and that has very different physical requirements. As for the iPhone, we actually have iPhone apps, because you're right, even the fact that this operates on the iPhone, which is great. That's still not super ideal simply because of the amount of data that we're showing. You're absolutely right. So we have apps for football and basketball. Unfortunately, we don't have them for hockey or NHL. So that's sort of why we had to make this usable on all iOS devices. But you're right, the experience is not ideal, and the experience is not ideal because we have touch enabled the desktop. We haven't made a perfect touch experience. So he's right. Yeah.
Simple thing. When you were combining these things and you were using CSS hardware accelerated transforms and transitions and things like that, did you ever come across Flickr? Flickering other divs or other CSS controlled items on the page, flickering or disappearing?
I have not come across that. What I've maybe there is something where I sometimes do come across sort of. Let's see if we can make this happen. A bit of a hold on a second. Oh, that's right. It's there's a oh, okay. So what the okay. So which is. And here's a couple other examples, and this is why making sure that animations could run in parallel were important. Is just that when you start dragging, like when I replace something, it's going to animate out the thing here, and it's also going to throw in this thing up top here. And you notice it's sort of a little 3D barn door thing. That lets it be visible. Before we just faded it out slowly, but this barn door thing lets it, be the actual text be readable for longer. But sometimes what happens is, and let's see if I can make it happen, is that you'll get, see how that this ugly reflow up here happens? And I think that was happening because of, but I didn't think that was because of the CSS transition, so I haven't seen that elsewhere. It's happening because when we start to dragging, we have to create a bench row down here, which means we're changing this, we're adding a row to a table. That's sort of one of the most kind of expensive things you can do. And that reflow comes and goes. I'm happy that in this example it was particularly bad. I'm not happy about it. I'm actually disappointed horribly. But I'm happy that when I tried to show the example it worked, because sometimes it's free and clear entirely.
I managed to do it. I used a whole mess of transitions on one page. All the same one, but when you click it and you hit your finger on it, it flickers at the top exactly like that.
Interesting.
There's no JavaScript on the page.
All right, so maybe my advice about using the transforms was crap. No, I'm kidding. No. No. I'm just saying, it turns out there may be an issue. Who knew? I'll do some experiments and see if I can recreate and see if that issue continues to occur without it.